Great. Well, again, thank you so much for having me today. And thank you for the invitation and that kind introduction. Again, my name is Afua Bruce. I'm the Chief Program Officer at DataKind, and I have just been enjoying the conversations that we have been having over the past couple of days. I think there have been some great panels and some great information shared. And so just really have appreciated the work. So just to recap sort of how our journey has been over the past couple of days and how we've gotten to where we are today. We started off the conference this week by talking about law and ethics and how design impacts policy and misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Yesterday, we spent time talking about trustworthiness of hardware and how do you build that in. Then looking at one of my favorite topics, data and data governance. And then also examining some of the reasons behind the distrust in big tech. And then today we've had some really interesting conversations, including this panel that just finished on innovating for trust and regulations. And so with all of that, I think one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, what has that left us to conclude about what trust and trustworthiness means for the tech sector? Now, I would argue that it leads us to conclude that the tech sector isn't perfect and the tech sector isn't working for everyone. Many of you on this call may say, well, I didn't need this conference specifically to tell me that, but I think a lot of the conversations this week just really highlighted some of the shortcomings in the way that the tech sector is structured now, and how the tech sector works with other parts of our society. So I want to step back for just a second and take a chance to introduce myself a little bit more. My background, I've had the privilege of spending part of my career in the private sector, worked at IBM for a while on their big servers, and just doing hardcore development in the private sector. I've spent some time in government, both as a federal government employee, working at the FBI and the White House, but also then working through fellowships and with teams outside of government, with state and local governments to enact policy and to make change there. I currently work at a nonprofit. Again, DataKind is a nonprofit, and I spent some time at New America as well. And I am also adjunct faculty at Carnegie Mellon, and so I'm counting academia there, which is just to say that my perspective today really does bring into account how different sectors view some of the challenges that we have. So a little bit about DataKind. DataKind itself is a nonprofit organization that seeks to leverage data science and AI in the service of humanity. And we do that by finding social sector organizations, NGOs, and government agencies, and helping them to identify their true problems that they're trying to solve, and how data and AI will help solve those problems and help have an outsized impact on those organizations' operations. We also recruit and manage teams of volunteers, teams of pro bono data science experts to build these solutions. And we're fortunate enough to have about 20,000 volunteers in our network. We've got 5 chapters across the world who are all doing projects, who are working on the ground, and now even more so remotely, to execute these projects. And then as we are doing this work and we've matched the social sector organizations with our volunteers, we then make sure that we deliver a solution that the organization can do something with after. So that transition period to making sure the social sector organization we partnered with can actually take the solution and run with it, we make sure that that transition happens well. And all of the work that we do is really about wicked problems. And so some of you may be familiar with this definition of what is a wicked problem, but it's essentially a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. I think we can all think of a number of wicked problems in general, certainly a number of wicked problems that we've talked about through the conference this week. And just to give you an example of what it looks like to solve those problems from the DataKind perspective, I'll walk you through a couple of recent DataKind projects. So the first project I wanted to talk about is our project with Global Witness, which is an organization based in the DRC. This organization exists to fight corruption in the mining sector. And so we as DataKind partnered with them a few years ago to see what we could do by looking at publicly available satellite imagery to detect landmines and where there might be unsanctioned landmines in order to protect against health and safety of people living in the area. We had a team of volunteers led by a pro bono expert from Google Brain, I believe, and they spent some time working with the team at Global Witness and developed an algorithm that ended up highlighting that using the publicly available satellite imagery was not quite as accurate as we had hoped. It was accurate in the sense that it could indicate where likely illegal mining was detected. And this was actually super useful for Global Witness because they were then able to deploy their investigative services a lot more efficiently than they had been in the past. They had been previously relying on a lot of word of mouth to identify where illegal mining activity had been happening. But with the tool that we developed, they were able to target those deployments a lot more. We had another project with SIMPA Networks where we used historical customer payment behavior to predict which new applicants were likely to be a good fit for SIMPA Networks' new pay-as-you-go solar power systems. Now, we were able to look at the information that was there and run our analysis, and we found that customers who made 3 or fewer payments in the first 180 days had about a 60% chance of having their solar system repossessed. And so we were able to work with SIMPA Networks again and develop an algorithm that indicated to them who might be a good fit for this program. And after they had adopted our solution, SIMPA actually found that they were able to reduce delayed payments by almost a third, while still accepting about 70% of their total customer pool. So there, again, making sure as close to a win-win-win solution as possible, and that SIMPA Networks minimizing their delayed payments, people who had access to their system getting to keep access and not have it and have their systems repossessed. So that's a little bit about DataKind, but back to trust and trustworthiness. I think what's the take-home point for me here is that trust and trustworthiness are wicked problems, right? They are problems that have incomplete and contradictory information and have a lot of stakeholders that you have to manage. And so then the question is, well, what can we do about it? How do we go about solving these wicked problems? I think there are 3 main things that we can pursue. The first is by focusing on equity inclusion at the start. I think several times we have a temptation when we talk about equity and inclusion in the tech sector, we leave it as an afterthought, or it's the last thing we think about. And we've developed a plan, we've developed a solution, we've written our wireframe diagrams, and we've drafted policy proposals. And at the end, we say, did we include everyone we meant to include? Are there any disparate impacts? I think we need to flip that and really start as we're designing, start by addressing equity and inclusion. This means centering humans. That's really all there is there. We need to center humans in the technology that we develop, and the policies that we develop, and the regulations that we develop. We need to make sure that as we are putting together teams of people to design these solutions, to design the policies, to design the regulations, that we are being inclusive, because starting with an inclusive design process where you really value the expertise of multiple players and multiple perspectives, that will lead to more inclusive solutions. And finally, I think it's important to remember that designing for the margins often leads to better products for all. As schools over the past year have transitioned to online learning, for example, school systems and technology systems that didn't just immediately make a switch to the first technology system available, but took the time to say, what might students who have learning disabilities or reading disabilities or sight impairment, visual impairments, or hearing impairments need to make sure that they can interact with the technology better. Solutions that were developed around those specifications and people on the margins, traditionally considered on the margins, led to better experiences for everyone and led to systems where everyone could see the information more, could click through and access the information and the educational materials more easily and in a more streamlined way. Now, the second thing that I think is important to consider is iterate and innovate. I think this is one thing that the tech sector does get right a lot of the time. Tech sector is often known for iterating and innovating and incorporating of agile and everyone using agile, whether or not they actually know what agile means or if they're using it correctly. But that's the mindset people often want to have. And so as you are looking for ways, whether you are writing new code, whether you are looking at your supply chain and making sure it's secure, whether you're thinking about how do we approach cybersecurity from a slightly different angle to reduce the dependence on an individual person and an organization, it's important to challenge yourself to think, who are you creating solutions with? How do you move forward with change? These two things go hand in hand, I believe, because you need to make sure that as you are creating solutions, even within a particular organization, that you've taken the time to build coalitions at various levels of the organization to make sure those solutions can be carried forward with an appropriate amount of support. If you are working on a policy or regulation, again, it's important to think of the coalitions that you're building to really have that groundswell of support and something that can sustain a movement and can continue to apply pressure on policymakers or lawmakers or regulators or wherever the correct inflection point is. Now, I think it's also really important here to recognize that perfection may not be achieved. I'm sure some of you are listening to me now and thinking, well, Afua, I'm perfect. I am glad that is you. But even if you were perfect, working in an imperfect system, I think it's really important to recognize that it's important to start small and get the small pieces right. Use that to build momentum, whether it's with designing an unemployment benefits access system, or whether it is figuring out how to secure our nation's top security systems, national security systems, or whether it's writing policies around broadband access for all. It's important to start small, test out the solutions that work, and use that to build momentum, to iterate as you figured out what works and what could have been improved, and take that to the next step and to the next step and to the next step. It is so easy when working on these large issues that affect a country, that affect a city, ultimately that affect people's lives and livelihood, to be tempted to tackle everything at once and to start and stop with the grand vision. But execution matters when lives are at stake. And the final of the 3 points that I have here is we think about how do we solve the wicked problem of trust and trustworthiness in the tech sector, is to move deliberately and fix things. Now, I know there are a few different versions of this quote here, but I think especially when you are interacting with governments or you're interacting with NGOs that are delivering solutions, it's important to really move deliberately and fix things. And so that means first, making sure that you do understand the institutions of government. So things like laws, things like ethics, things like regulation, things like hiring, things like procurement. It's really important to understand these pieces so you understand the correct levers to pull and where you need to continue to apply pressure, where you need to continue to educate, where you need to continue to develop specific technology or software to actually have an impact, rather than spending a lot of energy to not have that impact. It's also important to recognize that there are paths to change both inside and outside of organizations. So, with government specifically, one path to change is becoming a federal employee, for example, a civil servant at the federal level, and working on developing the actual code that would be implemented for, let's say, a healthcare access website. Um, so that is one path to change. Another path is the policymaker route or regulator route, but also advocacy organizations outside of government, academia, outside of government, general public has a really strong piece to play here as well. And so it's important to realize that as you are looking to improve trust and trustworthiness, there are a lot of different angles from which you can make change. And then finally, this is one of the things I stress the most as people look to innovate as it relates to government. It's important to insert whatever innovation you make back into the process of government or back into a process of an organization with which you're working. When I worked at the FBI, for example, there was a particular system that had all of the FBI's policies and procedures. It was a lot of effort, I can definitely say, to get anything into the manual. But because it was a lot of effort, and because it being a government institution, people relied on stated policies and stated processes, anything that was in that policy manual did dictate how everyone who touched that policy or touched that work actually interacted. And so what I quickly learned is that even if you change something outside of that policy manual, if you changed it and people changed their behavior accordingly, worked that process accordingly, as soon as you or whoever was advocating for that change moved on, that change would die with that. The change would also move on and would not survive. However, if you took the time and effort to understand that process, to understand how to get the policies and the directions back into the policy manual, in part because it was so difficult to change, that change then, that innovation would live on forever. And so I think it's a really critically important to, as we think about building trust and building trustworthiness, how do we do it in a systematic way, in a systemic way, so that it's not just a single person, it's not just a single group, but it's actually then built back into a system so that that change, that increase in trust and trustworthiness continues on past specific individuals, past a specific moment in time. And finally, and I've touched on this in a few other slides, but again, I want to just reiterate, it's important to consider the ecosystem for change. Again, people in different perspectives and different roles, whether in government, whether outside of government, with NGOs, outside of NGOs, whether they're volunteers or pro bono experts like we have at DataKind, whether they are civil servants or political appointees or elected officials, whether they're advocacy groups, whether they're researchers in academia, whether they're in Silicon Valley, or literally any other technical talent in the rest of the country, as it does exist, really do have a part to play. And then it's important too to make sure that you are educating the public, as was just talked about on the panel. General public now cares about the Facebook versus Apple conversation. And so that can then apply pressure in different ways that you can then leverage to, again, make sure that the changes you were trying to drive through, the work to build trust is actually having an impact. Or if the trust is not increasing, using the general public then to apply pressure and to hold people accountable to continue to make changes, or to begin to have a desire to make change, or a desire to regulate, to force change if the desire will not come on its own. And so with that, I just want to close and allow a few minutes for questions, I believe, with one of my favorite quotes from the now deceased John Lewis, which is, "Nothing can stop the power of a committed and determined people to make a difference in our society." So again, when I think of trust and trustworthiness, it is about people. It is about institutions, but institutions do not change. Institutions on their own do not have trust. Institutions on their own are not trustworthy. It does require individuals to invest the time and the labor to make it happen. And again, with this John Lewis quote, nothing can stop the power of a committed and determined people to make a difference in our society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Afua. That was a great presentation. And I think it ended on a nice, to steal from last year's theme, optimistic, not pessimistic tone and talking about trust. So my question for you, I'm sorry, I'm Kelsey, I'm a 3L here at Colorado Law. And my question for you is, how can we incentivize a focus on equity and inclusion throughout the design process where the market falls short?
Yeah, and this is a great question because incentives do matter in order to make any change. I think that one way to incentivize focus on inclusion and equity is through public pressure. As events happen in our society, really making sure that you use those events to highlight disparities in systems. You can point to ongoing research that is done and continues to be done that shows disparate impacts on people. And if in the private sector work to combine those numbers to how it might be affecting someone's bottom line. And that if you are not addressing inclusion or equity, and you're systemically not including certain people in your solutions, companies are missing out on market share, for example. And so tying things to that financial incentive, I think, is really important.
Afua, I hope you won't mind that I step in with a question because I'm really interested. And there is one I see in the Q&A, so I won't take too long. But earlier this week, somebody talked about it's not enough to allow people from other backgrounds in the room because then you're still a gatekeeper. And they're still like, they can be disallowed, so they might not speak up. But I feel like to an extent, there is always an allowance because engagement takes time and resources. And there are people from communities who won't have that as readily available as people who come with a certain level of privilege. Is there something that we can do to provide just the baseline level for people to be able to engage in these conversations early with the same brain power and brain space as people who have more privilege?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think there are a couple of different things I want to hit on this. And so one, it's important to, as you said, to invite people to the table early. Again, starting with that, making sure that any invitations to participate do not seem like an afterthought, do not seem like a checking the box exercise, but really making sure that it's even the way that you invite people to the tables is done in an inclusive and respectful manner, I think is really important. I think also it is important to, if you are working on gathering input to create some type of user-informed policy making process, for example, that any events you have do allow space for reflection and for listening. And so people who may not have had the time to take the space beforehand can in that event reflect and process and really contribute in the ways that you need to contribute. And then I think it's important to, when you say you're listening and you want contributions, to actually listen and actually act on what's being said. I think at the end of the day, actions matter more than words, and showing how contributions are incorporated into solutions, are incorporated into the formulation of the next steps is really important to continue to build trust or to build the trust. And then I think finally recognizing that there's no shortcut to doing this. It is hard work, it is long work, and it will take time and sustained effort.
Thank you so much for that. So I'll read you from Grady Ward in the chat. We have thanks for your work and for sharing it. And I'm going to voice that thank you because it's from all of us, I think. I'm curious about how your team worked to build equity validation into the project you referenced that attempted to predict default rates. Could you talk about how you all avoided the discrimination pitfalls inherent in that kind of work.
Yeah, and so I think a couple of things. So discrimination pitfalls exist in any type of sort of anything that's really involving algorithms or any type of analysis, right? And so as we have our design process that we're going through at DataKind, we do ask people to think of, the answers to question of who benefits from this, who could be harmed from this, who could be harmed from this if this works as intended. And so really thinking through that. We're also even undergoing a process right now at DataKind to really communicate to our pro bono experts that we have who do the work and reinforce to ourselves who are on staff that when we say data for good, or we say tech for good, things aren't inherently good because you're working for a government agency or for a nonprofit organization. It matters the way that you do the work in order to really qualify as that data for good or tech for good. And so to that end, we right now, for example, are putting together a bunch of resources that talk about bias in algorithms. We are putting together more defined checklists and guidance documents for our volunteers to sort of walk them through this process to make sure that as we're developing our solutions, as we're having those conversations with our project partners, that we're thinking of what are the ways this could go wrong and what are the ways that we need to sort of double down on and ensure that as we're developing this tool, things are still being inclusive and not discriminatory.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Victoria Venzer to thank you. If she's on screen with us, there we go.
Hi, thanks, Amy, and thank you for your lovely presentation. That was a truly excellent way to conclude this conference. And now I want to turn the floor over